Hello, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome. Good evening to this final Bright Blue public panel event. We've been doing over 30, so I'm feeling exhausted and relieved that this is the final session, but it's a very good one to end on. What an interesting topic, which is Electric Britain equipping the power grid for increased electrification. So those of you who don't know Bright Blue, we're an independent think tank for liberal conservatism. Our mission is to defend and improve liberal society. We do that across 4 research themes: environment policy, social policy, education policy, and employment policy. And in recent years, we've been particularly influential on the government's energy and environment policies, in particular the phase out of coal and bringing that forward, decarbonising gas, as well as looking at things like agriculture and decarbonising agriculture. The new ELM scheme that DEFRA have introduced, we provided a blueprint for that about 4 or 5 years ago. We're working on this event, Enertechnos, and we're very grateful to them for the partnership, and you'll be hearing from Dominic on the panel during this debate. If you're tweeting, please use the hashtag BrightBlue, and if you're saying things nice, please use our Twitter handle mentioning us, saying @WeAreBrightBlue, and you can also do the same for Enertechnos, at Enertechnos. For those of you watching on the live stream, hello from wherever you might be, and if you want to engage with this session, you can do by clicking onto the YouTube video on the Slido link, and you can ask a question. Tell us your name, where you're from, and then I'll be able to ask the question through my phone. So, some of the key questions we want to explore in this is how important and viable is increased electrification for achieving net zero emissions by 2050? How will demand for electricity vary and change across different economic sectors on that path to net zero? What upgrades are needed to ensure that Britain's power grid is enabled, can support and enable that increased electrification? And what are the main areas of inefficiency in current electricity generation infrastructure? Great. Okay, so 5 minutes from each of the panellists, and then we're going to take questions and contributions from the floor. So let me introduce the panellists. So Graeme Stewart, who is the Minister of State for Climate, sends his apologies, but we will be passing on the key messages so he hears them loud and clear from this. Have Graeme Cooper to my near left, who is the Head of Future Markets at the National Grid. Clementine Cowton to my near right, who's the Director of External Affairs at Octopus Energy Group. Next to her is Professor Philip Mawby, who is the Head of Electronics, Power and Microsystems at the University of Warwick, the best university there is, as I went there. And then Dominic Quennell, who is the Chief Executive Officer at Enertechnos. Stephen Bush, who is a columnist at the Financial Times, was also due to come and speak. Looks like we're empty seating him, but I'm hoping that he might still be able to come for a short period, but he has got a deadline in his journalism. Right, so 5 minutes each. I think what we'll do is start with Graeme.
Okay, look, I'll try and keep this really simple because Clem will tell you I could fill the full hour quite comfortably. So I think just looking backwards, there's a few things just to talk about. So the dirtiest thing we've done as a country since the start of the Industrial Revolution was make power. Okay, what people often forget is in about 2017, that changed. Now, it didn't change suddenly. That's because we've been slowly phasing out coal. We've had the growth in renewables. But when I look to the change that's been happening over the last 15 or 20 years, energy networks are in the middle of the change, whereas most people stand here and they say, well, what's changing? Electric cars, electric heat, decarbonisation. So for us, we're kind of halfway there. It still means there's a lot to do, and we've probably done the easier half. The other thing I think, as we look forward, to give context, and I think it will then help with the theme for the rest of the discussion, is by 2045, 2050, the UK will consume at least twice the amount of electricity than we do today. To be able to do that, we will need at least 4 times the amount of clean generation than we have today. And to do that, we will need twice the grid capacity than we have today. Now, those stats actually come from the Committee on Climate Change's Balanced Pathway, which obviously help government and have impartial advice on climate policy. So when I look at that, though, those three stats are, that twice the consumption, 4 times the amount of clean generation, twice the grid capacity, assumes that consumers will consume dynamically, very efficiently, use it when it's plentiful, rein back when it's not. They'll be engaged prosumers. They will have time of use tariffs. They'll have electric cars and they'll have heat pumps, but they will be able to do some demand side management to help the grid networks. It also assumes that grids are fully optimized. So at the moment, we build grids to peak, the worst day of the worst day of the worst day, plus some headroom. But that means at the time it's not fully utilized, theoretically it's a little inefficient. So if we can smooth the amount of volume of energy across the wires more efficiently, it benefits everyone. And then the final piece of that is having really good, accurate forecasting. Because if you know it's going to be windy and sunny, you want to signal to consumers that they can charge cars, heat water, do their laundry. If it's going to be dark and rainy and not very windy, you might want to rein back and not do those things. So we're in a situation now where everybody's part of that transition. And it is a transition, it's not a cliff edge. This is not something that is going to happen dramatically. But already, as National Grid, when people think about, will the grid cope? Today, we have enough applications for grid connections for generators to achieve net zero. So if people are worried that there isn't going to be enough electricity, I'm not sure that we're losing any sleep over it. We can already see big generators in a variety of forms applying and paying for grid connections over the next 12 to 14 years. The other piece that I want to dwell on just briefly is we will need flexibility everywhere. So I know often people say, well, the answer is we're going to have lots of big batteries. Well, batteries are a flexibility solution, but we will need more interconnection with other markets. We will need, as I said before, demand-side management. We will need storage in the form of maybe hydrogen and salt caverns, in geological formations. We may need people to, fill car batteries when there's plenty of cheap energy on the system. But what's nice is, I guess there's a point here where we're almost at a phase where there's a democratization of energy. So for our entire lives, we've had energy done to us. You receive a bill at the end of the month. Often you don't understand what it's a page of numbers and there's a pain point. But actually, as people pick up EVs and use EVs, they learn more about energy. I know I did. The surprise to me was I've been talking about kilowatts and kilowatt hours for a number of years. And I learned more about kilowatts and kilowatt hours in about the first 20 minutes of owning an electric car than I'd learnt in many years of being there. Because the strange thing is, when we write things down, kilowatt hours, if you touch it, it'll kill you, right? Whereas actually, if you drive an EV, instantly 250 kilowatts is 0 to 60 in 4.6 seconds. You suddenly have an emotional attachment or a realization of what it means. But also additionally, when you think about a battery with 75 kilowatt hours in it, that's 200 miles. Well, the nice thing for me is I know that I use 200 miles of energy in 4 days at home. So I now have context for my energy use. So I think on the journey we're in, we need flexibility everywhere. The grid will continue to evolve as it has done for the last 20 years, but we do need everybody to play their part so that we get there in the cheapest and most efficient and seamless way. So anyway, that's me, that's my 5 minutes. I'm done.
Great, thank you, Graeme.
He's actually timed himself.
Yeah,
I have.
timed you. You were slightly over.
17 seconds. I'll give you that back at the end.
Very impressive.
But you were slightly under when you did the London Marathon. That's
I was slightly under my time when I did the London Marathon, so that's okay. It all netted
It all
out.
balances out. One question I was going to ask you was around the impact of climate change
Yes.
and more extreme weather, and your thoughts on how that might change. How do you build a kind of resilient, reliant grid in the face of those more extreme weather events?
Oh yes, so we're in the middle of that right now. So for those in the room and those listening online, we have a license condition that says we need to deliver 99.999987 reliability. We call it the 4 nines. So if you do the sums, that's less than 7 seconds a year. So we have one of the most reliable grid networks in the world. But if you link what I said before, that we've got to double the grid capacity, we've also got a network that's aging and needs updating at the same time as the climate's getting worse. That's a significant challenge because we need to maintain the reliability. So we are doing a huge amount of work on life extension, on asset management. We are looking at all of our substations and putting in flood defences or looking and planning to elevate them so that they're raised. We see, obviously risk. The biggest risk for us is debris, actually. But most of our kit is reasonably reliable because it is high up. It's heavy equipment. But we recognise that in the distribution system, the kit is smaller, lighter, nearer to the ground, and they have an ever-increasing challenge to both double the capacity and try and maintain and improve their reliability too. So there's a lot of people burning a lot of grey matter and a lot of good engineering trying to look at making a more resilient grid in light of the climate challenge we see. But there's a couple of byproducts. We can put more energy across the same cross-sectional area of wire when the wind's blowing strong. It has a cooling effect. So we're doing dynamic load rating. We're pushing more power through the same bit of wire because actually we can monitor it more closely.
Great, fascinating stuff. Thank you, Clementine.
Thank you, Graeme. I want to talk, I think, a bit about how, if we kind of raise up a level or step back a little bit about how the grid needs to change in its structure to enable large-scale electrification. But before I do that, I just want to, I think, your first question, Ryan, actually was about, should we do electrification? How important is electrification? And I think it's really important to state that large-scale electrification is firstly the only way that we are going to achieve net zero, but secondly the only way we're going to do it, way we're going to increase our economic competitiveness as a nation. As an illustration of that, if we take the example of heating, if we were to shift our heating demand from methane gas to hydrogen gas, we would be importing a third more methane gas. So we would be increasing our imports from places like Russia or alternatives are available. That is fundamentally a much less efficient economy and a much less energy secure country. When you then compare that with the heat pumps are 3 to 4 times more efficient than a gas boiler. That would make running hydrogen heating 6 times more expensive for a householder than running an electrified heat pump.
Can you turn the mic towards it because I can't hear it?
Can you hear me? No, I don't know if it's on.
It is on. That's for the live stream. But if you could,
Project.
All right,
if you could just
sorry,
project.
I thought I was being
If you could just
amplified.
project. Thank you.
Okay, should I start again? So we have this imperative that we absolutely have to electrify, but that means that the grid has to look very different and be run very differently at a system level. Historically, what we've had is, in essence, a Secretary of State acting as the kind of fat controller of our entire energy system, procuring power on behalf of customers and then transporting it through the wires to the end user, who become these sort of passive off-takers. What we need to do, in fact, is flip that so that customers are driving forward competition. In fact, I've written down three C's here: customers, competition, and contestability. What we need to have is price signals set at a local level that encourage power to be used in the most efficient way possible. So that's reforming network price signals so that they are strong, dynamic, granular, and they encourage using power at times when there's lots of it available and as locally as possible. In order to do that, we need to see massive reform of the various network companies. So DNOs, for example, don't publicize data, so it's not possible to help them update their find new ways of doing things. They don't use advanced statistical methods to forecast demand. It's often quite difficult to get connections, and there's no contestability available. Likewise, actually, at the national level, sorry, Graeme, there's 400 gigawatts of power generation sitting, of renewable energy generation sitting, waiting for a grid connection from National Grid. So this is absolutely massive amounts of capacity, and and Graeme has said we need to double capacity, sitting, waiting in the system to come forward. So we need to figure out ways to unlock that system with a much greater degree of contestability and competition, so that we're able to drive down prices for customers and get those efficiencies into our economy.
Great, thank you. Max, could I just ask you to switch off the aircon, because that might just help with people's listening. It's just here in the corner behind the curtain. If you just press the off button. Right. Okay. So.
Or you could all come closer.
Yes, you can if you wanted to. Yeah, that's true. But that should help. Okay. So, Professor Mawby, over to you.
Okay, so I guess I'm odd one out here because I'm not from industry, I'm from academia, but I've got a different view on the future of electricity and the grid. So the electricity grid of the future, everything that's just been said is absolutely true. Electrification of everything is the only way we're ever going to achieve net zero. Burning stuff is a thing of the past, I believe. But the grid, given that, the grid of tomorrow will look very much different to what it is today, I believe. The grid of today mainly consists of a large amount of copper and a large amount of iron. So that's the transformers and all the wires, etc., and aluminium. Whereas the grid of tomorrow will have another component to it. It'll have semiconductors in it. And semiconductors are a key core technology which allows a lot of the interconnections to take place, and it's really part of the core infrastructure. President Biden gave a speech a few months ago where he held up a wafer and said, "This is infrastructure," and it really is. So the grid of the future will be copper, iron, and semiconductor. So the semiconductor is what makes the grid controllable and hence smart. So we're talking of using semiconductors to control electrical power right up to the gigawatt level, to the very highest powers that you can possibly think of, right down to milliwatts, depending on what you're trying to do with that power. Today, the grid, asynchronous grids, that's grids from different countries that work on different clock frequencies, etc., can be connected together using point-to-point conversion HVDC systems, which rely totally on power electronics to do that. So the way we bring energy in from France or wherever is via power electronics. So it's well known in these circles, and it's really, really very efficient, high 99%. So the same technology is used to implement the collection of power in the North Sea. How do you connect all these wind farms together? You don't just join the wires together. You've got to use some quite sophisticated power electronics to make that happen and to control it. So at high power levels, power electronics is used every day and to process and convert energy from AC to DC and vice versa. And it gives us the ability to connect disparate power systems seamlessly together, and without the public ever really knowing that. But it's a really important technology today in the grid. So how is this? How does this impact on the grid more generally? Well, and closer to home. Well, transportation is ubiquitous, so every form of transportation can be electrified. Everything from air transportation, ships are already heavily electrified, trains, of course, and of course the thing which is big at the moment is electric vehicles. Every form of transportation can be electrified. And in the grid, power electronics is essential where renewable energy needs to be connected. So every piece of renewable, whether it's wind, solar, whatever, needs to be conditioned and connected to the grid using that sort of technology. Intermittency, which is what we're talking about with energy storage, also has to be controlled by this technology. And whether you store it as in a battery, which seems to be quite possible at the moment, or in other forms of energy storage, then it's really key to all of those for transporting it over long distances, storing it and getting it back out again. So what's new? Well, as you know, silicon, it's been in the news a lot recently as a technology which is stopping people producing cars. There's some debate about that, but it's just as important to the production of a flexible grid structure of the future. And so it's the same silicon technologies. However, what's new is that there's a new drive towards different materials. Instead of using silicon, using materials which are called wide bandgap materials, which you've probably never heard of, but things like silicon carbide and gallium nitride, these do the same function as silicon, but with much, much higher efficiencies, and are eminently suitable for high power, anything above a few kilowatts to make that transition. For example, the world's best-selling passenger vehicle at the moment, the Tesla Model Y, which I just bought the other day, uses that technology. So it's the first commercial vehicle on the road to make use of silicon carbide. And all the other car manufacturers are scrambling like mad to implement exactly the same technology. And it's not just applicable to cars, it's applicable everywhere. So the future is for clean generation and connection and transportation of energy. The physical transportation systems all rely on robust, flexible and efficient infrastructure afforded by that new technology. And the UK actually is well placed to take advantage of this. It's something which will penetrate the grids from the very highest level down through to the DNOs, where there's very little of this technology at the moment, very little. But it will have a dramatic impact there as well. But we can manufacture and design and build that stuff in the UK if we set out to do so. All the major economies in the world, China, of course, USA, Japan, even the EU, are really investing heavily in this technology. And they're all trying to build their own capability onshore in their own countries because this is such an important core technology. And just one thing at the end, there's a government initiative called Driving the Electric Revolution. Well, this technology really is driving the whole of the electric revolution, right from the very highest power levels, integration of the whole grid with electric vehicles, with electrified transportation and renewable systems. So that's my message, which is probably different to everybody else's because I didn't mention any economics, but it is really core to the flexibility of the future grid that we'll see over the next 20 years.
Great, thank you, Philip. So, your thesis was, we need electrification everywhere for net zero. Now, there is some debate about that, right? Because, for example, in home heating, people say actually not every house is, a heat pump is not well suited to particular homes. Therefore, we need things like hydrogen, gas, and we need to be supporting that. What's your view on that? Do you have that sort of... do you have the view that you need that mix, or is it actually that everything is electric? That's the future.
Well, the big problem with hydrogen is where do you get the hydrogen from? That's the big question. It's not can you heat your house with hydrogen or drive a vehicle using hydrogen. It's where do you get the hydrogen from? It's not naturally available, you know. Well, it is. It's abundant in the air and everywhere. But to capture it and to store it and use it is very difficult. You have to make it out of something, right? I mean, the basic parts, oxygen and hydrogen, are all over the place. But, you know, electrolyzing water is a very inefficient process. And when you come to convert it, you lose a lot of the energy you had. You say you're going to double the grid. Well, you waste half of that energy if you convert it to hydrogen.
Well, yeah, probably more than that. I mean, my best
And when you convert it back again, you lose another half.
Yeah.
So
My best stat is if you drive a battery electric car 1 mile and you look at the energy component, the electricity component, you'd need 4 times the amount of energy to do the same mile in a hydrogen car.
I mean, this is so it's a technology which has got some applications. Maybe in aerospace, where weight is a critical component, unlike terrestrial transport. But for energy storage and for normal transportation, I think unless you can get hydrogen cheaply and efficiently without wasting a lot of energy doing it, I can't see how it can succeed.
Right. So you're like Graeme, the 99.99967% of everything will be electricity, and a little bit will be.
No. I mean, that's reliability.
I know. I'm just making an intellectual leap. But
No. It's a good leap though. So I mean, the thing is, from a perspective, National Grid, even the electricity transmission bit of National Grid is technology agnostic. So we've even modelled a strategic motorway network, and you need a grid connection whether you're making hydrogen through electrolysis to fill a hydrogen truck, or you need the same size grid connection if you're going to use it to put in a battery truck. So it doesn't really matter what's on the end of my wire. I think the thing from my perspective is, what is the low regrets thing to do? If the answer to trucking is either hydrogen or battery, and both of those need a grid connection along the motorway network, should we just get on with the grid connections along the motorway network whilst the two technologies, you know, there's some low regrets things. But also I think, you know, do you rely on government saying this is the winning technology, or do you set out the stall and let the winning technology win?
I think it's worth noting, by the way, I'm trying to look up a stat that I wrote down yesterday, that we are a very long way off, by the way, sure whether hydrogen can even work in homes.
Yes.
The only pure hydrogen trial of heating in homes has been very badly delayed because of technology issues. Currently, the budget for that is, I think, £43 million, so effectively a cost per home of £100,000 to upgrade those homes to heating with hydrogen. That's before they start and being cost twice as much to heat versus natural gas, and 6 times as much to heat versus a heat pump. And of course, conveniently forgets that hydrogen is extraordinarily explosive gas. And would result in 4 times as many explosions in the home than we currently, very high level that we currently
Basically
see.
a rocket.
I mean, NASA really struggles to stop hydrogen exploding. You can't, in the places where you store hydrogen, you're not allowed to have electric lighting because it's so explosive. Why on earth? I wouldn't want it in my house, and I particularly wouldn't want it if an opportunity to actually reduce my bills through a heat pump versus what they are currently today with a gas boiler. Finally, I think it's really important to understand that the myth about not every home is suitable for a heat pump has been pretty thoroughly debunked now. So, for example, the Energy Systems Catapult has done some analysis for the government, which has found that there is no type of building for which it is not possible to heat with a heat pump. It may not be the building that you first go to when you're starting your heat pump market scale up, because there are homes, 40% of homes today are ready for a heat pump without any significant changes or upgrades. You can just swap it like for like almost with a gas boiler. But there is no home that is not suitable to be heated with a heat pump.
I thought I read somewhere about Norway, about 90% plus of homes have a heat pump. Is that right?
I don't know the stats, but it's very standardised.
It's the in a lot of Nordic countries, it is the default heating solution.
Yes. Interesting what you say about the trials around hydrogen, 100% hydrogen homes, because other people say it's going really well, that trial. So I'd be interested to see the final evaluation of that.
They've just
Well,
announced
but why let
yet
the facts
another
get in the way of a
delay.
good story?
Yes, I'll be interested to see the
Don't
final
forget, the houses in
evaluation. of that.
Norway and Scandinavian countries are a lot better built than ours. So their insulation in their building is another big contribution to why they use heat pumps. It's
I'm
really quite
actually,
efficient.
I think.
Yeah,
that-
you can use it,
Yeah.
but the houses are far better than ours.
The reason that we're not using heat pumps is simply that we've got an extremely cheap gas supply, historically.
Yeah,
Extremely
absolutely.
cheap gas supply and very cheap gas boilers. And it's the job of the industry now to get the cost of a heat pump down to an equivalent cost as a gas boiler, which, by the way, Octopus has done and is doing. So with the boiler upgrade scheme, for a typical house, it now costs the same to upgrade to a heat pump as it would to get a new boiler.
And the other thing that's interesting from the price cap that's obviously been recently in the news is it's now technically cheaper to run a heat pump than it is to run a boiler. Which was new news to me. Right, I just thought it was really, really interesting when you look
and by
at
the way, if you take into account servicing costs and the cost of a gas connection, you can save £400 per year versus a gas boiler.
Great. Okay, thank you very much. Let's move now finally for thoughts from Dominic and Enertechnos. Very, very interesting company. So tell us more.
I will. Anybody who can't hear me at the back, just stick a hand up and I'll crank up the volume. I'm Dominic Quennell, I'm the CEO of Enertechnos, and we're a clean tech innovator, and we're focused on delivering electricity more efficiently. And the way that we do that is through a different kind of cable design. And we were very keen to sponsor this discussion because we really think it's time that we had a proper debate on the readiness of the grid for the need for decarbonisation and for net zero in 2050. And there are some things I've really been struck by in the last 2 days, walking around and attending lots of these fringe events. And the first one is that decarbonisation and economic growth are not mutually exclusive, far from it. And there's time and time again, and Graeme Stewart said it again in a meeting about an hour ago, the focus on the growth economy absolutely includes a commitment to net zero. And the other thing which everybody here has just been violently agreeing with is that there needs to be a huge focus on electrification, because very nearly every time there's a question which involves decarbonisation, the answer is going to have electrification in there somewhere. There are some challenges that we need to overcome. And it's always very risky to disagree with Graeme about anything to do with electricity, but I'm just going to have a little one.
Go for it. It's all good fun.
I know. No, it's on the scale of the increase, because you've painted, Graeme has painted a picture of a very ideal system where everything is perfectly aligned and we only need twice as much electricity. But actually, the National Grid's own future energy scenario that they publish every July suggests it's more like 3 times the amount. So that's the first sort of caveat. I think a lot of this clearly comes from providing power for EVs and for home heating, which we've touched on both of those, and also aviation and maritime use as well. And we need to focus on that too. Let's not forget them. There are 2 elements I also want to address. One of them is infrastructure, and the other one is in market mechanisms, because that's all very much part of this picture. Professor Mawby's given some really interesting insights into the infrastructure and the way that it can change. And I think that innovation in the infrastructure is going to be absolutely key to getting this done. And that will certainly include some of the things that Professor Mawby's talked about. And I'd like to think it includes some of the things that Enertechnos proposes for the cabling that can go into grids and as export cable from renewables, so we can more efficiently bring more renewables into the grid. But the other thing is the market mechanisms. And for those of you who aren't sort of complete policy geeks, Ofgem's been reviewing the pricing mechanism, and they've come up with the very catchily entitled RIIO-ED2 framework, which basically is the way it governs the way that the DNOs, the distribution network operators, are remunerated for the provision of the services that they deliver. And there used to be a much stronger emphasis on grid efficiency and losses in particular, and there isn't in RIIO-ED2, and that slightly concerns us. And there's also not quite as strong an innovation program as there used to be through the ED1, which was the mechanism that preceded it. And we think that there are 4 things that need to be done. The first one is there needs to be a very clear signal from the government that the march to continued electrification is continuing. And there have been various things said in the last, whatever it is, 3 weeks since we had the new Prime Minister and her team, which have kind of shaken people's confidence in that. And I think they need emphatically to tell everybody that is not something from which they're resigning at all. There needs to be continued policy commitment as well, because the large corporates and the funds that are investing to deliver a lot of this technology need the certainty that the mechanisms aren't going to change. And changes in government energy policy seem to come along thick and fast, and it's really not a good system. We need to have certainty there. The second big thing, I think, and everybody here has touched on it, is there needs to be open recognition from government, from the regulator, and from the industry that this is going to be difficult. It's not easy to deliver 2 or 3 times the amount of electrical energy as we have been accustomed to using. It's a kind of once-in-a-generation challenge, although Graeme says we're halfway through it, but I think the hard yards still lie ahead. And I was concerned about, I don't know, 2 or 3 years ago, I was talking to an energy minister, and I was specifically discussing their level of confidence in the ability of the distribution, not the national grid, but the distribution networks, to deliver the energy needed for electric vehicles. And he dismissed it and said, as far as he was concerned, it wasn't a first-order problem. I beg to differ. I think it's very much a first-order problem. The third thing I would say is greater ambition in terms of regulation. And we need much more joined up thinking. There needs to be a better approach between the government and the regulator. And I think they need to be bolder in setting their ambitions, and they need to be more immediate in the way that they do it. And again, back to Graeme knows this, I bang on about losses a lot. But losses are really, really important. The IEA, the energy one, not the other one, they put out some data about 2 years ago saying that globally 1 gigaton of CO2 is emitted every year by transmission and distribution losses. That's an enormous target for decarbonisation. And they thought that with better and improved technology, about 40% of that could be saved. So definitely something worth going for. If you look at the UK, last year we imported 25 terawatt hours of electrical energy, and last year we lost 25 terawatt hours of electrical energy. Now, it's not possible to eliminate losses entirely. Be very clear about that. But I think we could do more about it. And it's costing consumers money as well. It's about £100 on everybody's bill. And the fourth and last thing I would say is that we won't get to where we have to be if we just do business as usual. It needs a fundamental shift in the approach from everybody, from government, regulator, industry, and the consumers. And this has to be approached as a kind of a team effort. And just the last thing I'd close with is I was at a conference in the US not very long ago, and somebody made a beautiful statement, which was, if you always do what you always did, you'll always get what you always got. And he was right. And I think this is the time where we've got to seize the opportunity and move this debate forward into action.
Thank you, Dominic.
Can I just have a right to reply? Because I think
Yes.
I think we violently agree.
Yeah, we do.
So I think my statement, which was twice the consumption, 4 times the clean generation, twice the grid, that's the best outcome. If we don't do all the clever stuff, then you end up probably nearer 3 times the consumption, But it's easier for me to work with 2, 4, and 2.
Yeah.
But, and actually, it's such an important point. How do we?
big promise.
That's where the concentration needs to be. I think in this conversation is how do we shrink it from 3 times to 2 times or even less?
Yep.
Because we are not using our grid intelligently, and we are about to load an astonishing number of batteries onto it that can either be a really big problem. So batteries both in terms of electric vehicles but also in terms of heat pumps. That can either be a massive challenge that can force us to have to massively overbuild extra grid capacity, or it can be an opportunity to help us to use our grid a lot more flexibly and therefore get more bang for our buck out of the existing wires. I think Phil and I were just talking earlier about which tariff he should move on to for Octopus Energy. One of them being the Octopus Go Tariff, which gives you...
Go faster.
Or Go faster. But let's talk about Go just for simplicity. Octopus Go gives you 4 hours of off-peak charging at night time, so for 7.5p per kilowatt hour. And it's about, something like 40p for the rest of the day. But at that 7.5p, bearing in mind that a full electric vehicle charge uses about a week's worth of household electricity, that is an absolutely, firstly, massive saving to the customer, but also a massive opportunity to shift a very large load to a time when there's not a lot of other demand on the system, when we've got lots of wind farms generating power that otherwise we're having to pay to turn off. With our Go customers, we've got 80,000 customers on Go, and they are charging in those off-peak windows with 88% reliability. That's absolutely massive amount of avoided grid costs, of avoided constraint payment costs to onshore wind farms, for example, offshore wind farms. The opportunity here to get to maximise our existing grid before we even start thinking about building out new grid is absolutely enormous, and is not being incentivised at all.
And I shall sign up to Octopus Energy when I get home.
Great. That's it. Well done. You've done your job there, Clementine.
I've got a code to give you that'll save you some money.
I've been offered it by several
Graham's first
people.
in line, then it's me.
Great minds think alike.
Right, let's open it up. Questions and contributions from the floor. And just to say, if you're watching on the live stream, please do ask through Slido. Tell us who you are and where you're from. Please do wait for the microphone before you ask a question, because people need to pick it up on the live stream. So we'll start with this gentleman right here in the front.
Thank you, Ryan. I think we need to get a bit of perspective here. It hasn't come out, and I'm sure you all know it. But I studied the future energy scenarios of the national grid, and they predict, well, first of all, the actual primary energy that this country produces, now not just electricity, it's all the other things, is around 2,000 terawatt hours. That's a huge number. But of that, only 15% or thereabouts is actually electricity. So when we get to 2050, we have to have it all electricity. I think we're more or less agreed. What we do with that electricity is another question. We might convert some of that into hydrogen, but ultimately we start out with that kind of amount. By 2050, the future energy scenarios thinks that we will reduce our consumption, our primary energy, to about 1,600, which is great. And they do that with better insulation, more efficient machines, and so on. But how are we going to ramp up the 15% of 2,000 all the way up to 1,600? That is electricity generation. Where's it all going to come from? And then, how do we connect it?
So would you like,
Yes, and sorry, just it's David, isn't it?
My name's David. I'm an energy consultant.
Yeah.
I lead the Climate Change Working Party of the Lunar Society based here in Birmingham that's been going for 250 years.
Thank you. Great.
So
So,
you've been leading
Graeme.
it for that long, have you?
Sorry?
You haven't been leading it for that long, have you?
No, not quite.
So let me give you some nice round numbers. So if anybody looked at the publication called the British Energy Security Strategy that was published just after the start of the Ukraine war, you realise that energy security is critical. So if you look at that broadly says 50 gigawatts of offshore wind by 2030, 24 gigawatts of nuclear, so potentially up to 8 new nuclear plants, not all big, a variety of sizes. 70 gigawatts of solar. A lot of people have come to me and said, well, that's not really possible. There's more than 50 gigawatts of seabed already licensed to wind developers who are already spending a lot of money. We already have 50 gigawatts at least of connected generation in offshore wind getting there. But to give you some context for the scale where it's all going to come from, but also how does it get there? National Grid has and working with government, we've just been through the process of the offshore transmission network review. How are we going to get all of that power into the energy system? So we have to upgrade the wires in the UK. There's 16 strategic wider works projects. That's somewhere between 15 and 20 billion pounds of infrastructure investment. And typically it would take us 9 years and 8 months to build one project. We've got 16 to deliver in 7 years. So linking the scale and pace, we're actually working very closely with Ofgem, which is, hang on, normally we would go to Ofgem with one project at a time to justify why. We're having to go with the full suite because it's a bit like the Olympics. You either build that to get 50 gigawatts onshore or you don't get to 50 gigawatts. So there's a lot of really interesting work, kind of almost pushing at the boundaries of how regulation works. So there's an element here of actually realising the problem holistically and trying to learn by doing and looking for those unintended consequences. So, we're going to need 32 large transformers, we're going to need 13,000 linear kilometres of overhead line conductor. We're going to have to think about diggers and qualified people to install this stuff. But of course, the upfront stuff is all the consenting piece, which is what's starting now. But it's a big job. It's a lot to do. And I think your comment was this is kind of our generation's industrial revolution, if I'm being honest.
Philip, did you want to come in?
Well, it's all very doable. We've got fantastic natural reserves in terms of energy in this country. It's just a matter of having a plan as a country to do that. I mean, the thing that amazed me is that in the 50s, 60s, when the national grid was built, then, we just did that as a nation without thinking about that. And that was kind of an investment then. And this is an equivalent investment that we've got to make nowadays, which is just as exciting. And, if we do it correctly, we can also create jobs in the UK. I mean, the important thing is that we've lost a lot of industry that manufacture those components in the UK. We can get those back in the UK, and we can, if we set our sights on it, we can become world leaders. Everybody else is doing this anyway. If we don't do that, we'll end up importing a lot of these components from overseas, and that just costs the economy even more. So we really need to focus as a country about getting this value in the UK. It's not just a cost then, it's a real benefit to the society which it's built for.
Great, thank you. Let's take some more questions. So this gentleman right at the back by the door.
Oh yes, actually I've been on Octopus for about 2 years and it works very well, and that's what brings me to my question. A couple of things I would like to see, but I don't know when it's going to happen. I'd like to see the rollout, or at least subsidise, of three-phase electricity connections so that we can actually get faster chargers and also get bigger batteries and maybe add additional solar panels, because I could easily deliver 10 kilowatt hour, but I wouldn't be able to because the DNO won't let me. So I'd like to know what's going to happen with that, and also will the government consider, do you think, taking the VAT off the battery for a start, and also maybe subsidising the connections for the three-phase for the properties which need to retrofit, because we're actually helping out the nation by helping to balance the grid. What do you think?
Great, and sorry, not to be rude, but who are you?
I'm Alok Mitra from Watford constituency.
Great, thank you. Very good question. So, did you want to come on that, Dominic?
Well, unfortunately, the government minister couldn't be here, so I don't think there's anybody who's available to comment on whether the government might make an adjustment on the VAT, though I would be very sympathetic to that. In terms of the three-phase connection, I mean, this comes right back to the question that I asked the energy minister 2 and a bit years ago about how comfortable is he that the DNOs can deliver, because the national grid can do it, but the DNOs I still think seem to be a bit of a choke point there, and there needs to be a greater degree of attention paid to what has to be done to help them to do more, because otherwise the whole thing falls out. I mean, if you can't connect your car, excuse me, you can't charge it. In a couple of years' time, when vehicle to grid starts to come back, you can't play in that game either. So it's got to come. And right this minute, I'm not confident that it's easy enough to get a three-phase connection. Well, you know from your own experience that you can't.
Yes, but also the reverse charging of electric vehicles would also help.
Yeah, well, precisely. I agree with you.
So very briefly, I have three-phase at home, and I don't put a faster charger in because I plug it in when I go to bed, and it's full when I wake up. So I don't see any benefit having a three-phase charger at home, if I'm being honest. That's just a practical thing. I would say it will be worth seeing what flushes out of the Rio ED2 strategy, because each of the regional DNOs, I think, are looking at do you future-proof homes by putting three-phase in? Do you retrofit when you need? And what's really interesting for me is I'm not an expert in distribution charging methodology and ED2, but I do know that a lot of work has gone in. What is it that you do if you have heat pumps, EVs, solar, battery storage to allow people to democratise energy? And I think from my perspective, that flushes out very shortly and then obviously kicks in from next year. So what I would say is it might be worth watching this space.
Great. Let's take some more questions. So this gentleman right at the back, and then this lady here. We'll take two.
Martin Newman, I'm a party member. My question is, what's the scale of the capex required by National Grid to increase the capacity that you indicated, and how's it going to be paid for?
Oh, okay.
Sorry, let me take another one.
Go on, take another one. Go on.
Sorry to really interrupt you. This lady here.
Thank you. Liz Swinkler, Herefordshire County Councillor. Herefordshire is a very large rural constituency, and we have very poor grid connection, and it's quite hard. We have a lot of land, so a lot of potential to do solar, and a lot of agricultural buildings, again, a lot of potential there, but that really struggle to get the connection. So, would it be sensible if we had a strategy that reflected where the best bang for your buck would be, as it were? Thank you.
Okay, good questions. Graeme.
I can try and pick up the first one. So with numbers off the top of my head, I know for connecting 50 gigawatts of offshore wind, we're about to spend somewhere between 15 and 20 billion pounds on 16 big grid upgrades. That allows us to get that 50 gigawatts of offshore wind onshore. How will we do that? Well, we're a price-regulated monopoly, so we're under the scrutiny of Ofgem in everything that we do. We are under a huge amount of drive to deliver economic and efficient investment. We will have to raise that money in the capital markets. There's a lot of infrastructure money looking for a home. Don't forget, the other thing I think people forget is the infrastructure that we put in today will be here 40 years' time. So I agree that the grids will have to evolve, but the wires we build today will still be fully operational and in their first life in 40 years' time. So it's a long-term investment, and of course in any recessionary environment, building infrastructure is a good way of building out of a recessionary environment that helps the country access that. And before somebody says, well, that's a lot of money to spend on wires, yes, but look at the clearing price of offshore wind. So offshore wind has got a clearing price in the £40 per megawatt hour, so that's 4p a kilowatt hour wholesale. So if we want large scale, high volumes of cheap energy that's homegrown, we have to build the wires for that to be able to arrive in people's homes. So it gives you an idea of the scale. The best place if you want a big number is the Committee on Climate Change 6th Carbon Budget. If you look at the balanced pathway, which is the most likely instruction manual to get to net zero, they actually do some hypothesis on cost of each of the technologies, cost of the infrastructure.
I'll get on it as soon as I get home.
Great. Okay, Clementine, I think maybe the second question you wanted to come in on.
Yeah, and I think there's by the way, I'm not an expert in the comms industry, so please correct me, but I understand that the kind of the monopoly of BT Openreach over the broadband connection business cost this country about a decade in broadband upgrade, and I think we're looking at a similar situation with networks, be that at the DNO level or national level. I certainly think that we should be starting to really hone in on where there might be opportunities for contestability, because, as you say, there are massive resources there for the taking, huge opportunities to build generation, but also to put in things that, slightly more higher demand technologies that are being held back by very old-fashioned regulated monopoly businesses. I note, for example, in India that in India the energy market operates differently. They don't have a privatised or a sort of competitive retail market. It's very standardised utilities, but they do have a contestable transmission network. And there's a company called Sterlite, I think it's Sterlite, who are building grid connections. At a more competitive price than than the equivalent of National Grid there in order to get stuff built, and they are looking, for example, in helping to support the mining industry to get lower carbon. So the opportunities for the grids and DNOs to move faster certainly does need to come out of RIIO-2. But also, I think we need to start really fundamentally rethinking how we parcel up the grid.
There is at distribution level, you can get an IDNO, an independent distribution network operator, so for contestability. I guess some of the challenges, particularly in rural areas, and I live rurally, is linear kilometres of cable costs a lot of money, and the further you go, the more it costs. So part of the challenge here is how do you dice up the cost versus the value extracted? And at the moment, it just sits around the understanding of cost. It's just linear meters of cable and the cost of transformers. So some of the challenge is that the kit just costs what the kit costs. But yeah, no, I appreciate that there is lots of opportunity to evolve networks in this opportunity to think differently.
And by the way, the kind of calculation of what the kit costs is never really investigated in a marketplace. So, a lot of those assumptions and the pathway, and they're really important, those pathways, but they do come from an industry that has a vested interest in giving some quite high quotes for some technology they'd quite like to put in the ground. I'm not, but and that's, by the way, I'm not saying that in a cynical way. It's just simply that those claims have not been tested. So what we found with, for example, the solar industry and the wind industry was that the kind of IEA assumptions for cost were beaten year after year after year, absolutely plummeted once they reached scale. And we should be looking for similar efficiencies and cost reductions across all technologies that we need to reach net zero.
Philip?
I think one of the questions that was asked earlier on is about three-phase charging or three-phase connections. Three-phase is really only needed for very high power charging, but there is a real pinch point in electrification of transportation. Once we go up into commercial vehicles, buses and lorries, they can be electrified, of course, but they need to be charged very quickly. And you're talking of megawatts, charging at megawatts in an hour, and megawatts per hour. And those sort of connections are very rare, and that's one of the pinch points, I think, for providing a fully electric transportation system for goods, is that ability to have those connections at many key strategic points around the motorway network, which I'm sure you've been looking at.
Well, SHAPS approved £950 million worth of spend, the Rapid Charging Fund, to future-proof all strategic road network connections.
Yeah.
Because a typical motorway has a 1 megawatt-ish connection now
Yeah,
for burgers and
that's
fruit machines.
one-
We're going to need 15 or 20 megawatts at each of those locations for cars and
So
trucks and
that's a
buses.
huge update in what, and
It is.
you know, all service stations are going to change, aren't they, over the next 15, 20
Absolutely.
years?
Absolutely.
They're not going to be doing what they do now. They've got
Yes.
spaces for.
But the thing to look out for is this autumn, and don't forget it's a political autumn, so it could run through into maybe January. I'm cutting some slack here, there's a lot of politics going on right now. But the delivery body for that £950 million rapid charging fund should be announced this autumn, and then the grid networks
Yeah.
will
But
get on with it.
It's always chicken and egg, isn't it?
It is very much
The
chicken and egg.
vehicles are just about there, but there's no point having the vehicles unless you can operate them economically.
Absolutely.
And, be able to
Absolutely.
use them as you use diesel vehicles now.
Dominic.
I just wanted to throw in a bit of a curveball into the discussion about charging for EVs, and that's wireless charging for EVs. Because at the moment, if you buy an EV, the chances are that you're either buying or you're donated kindly by the manufacturer a 3-metre length of cable that you cart around in the back. And if, like me, you don't have off-street parking and you live in London, if you're fortunate, you can find a lamppost that isn't being occupied by a diesel Range Rover. And if you're not, you're going to have to go and pay top dollar from Source London or one of those guys who are charging you 25p a kilowatt hour, and that hurts.
25p.
Yeah.
That's cheap.
Yeah, well, that's on a good day. But one of the applications that we've been looking at in conjunction with lots of other companies, it's not just us, is wireless charging, because the possibility for vehicle to grid opens up enormously if you have wireless charging, because that means that if you're parking, you're charging. You have a charging pad under your car, just like you have one in the back of the phone. You park and you're over a ground pad, which is delivering the energy that you need. And it changes the dynamic, because instead of people running EVs a bit like they do diesels or petrols, where you fully charge it and then you run it down to 20% and then you fully charge it again, often in a panic because you suddenly remember that you could promise to go and see your mum tomorrow. What you do is you continually top up. And this will come in on a big scale in about 5 years' time. The car manufacturers are going to start to fit the charge pads. But in the meantime, there are some very interesting trials going on with taxis. There's some other ones starting with ambulances, with fleets, last mile delivery, so that the electric, Amazon DPDs and so forth will start to do this. Because that is also going to help the grids to smooth out. Because if people who are driving the EVs are, first of all, only taking little bites at a time, they're grazing. And then when you have a lot of EVs, you've got this colossal storage of energy, which can be tapped at moments of peak demand. So just bear that one in mind. It's not mainstream yet. It won't be mainstream for 5 years, but believe me, it's coming.
Very interesting. Right, let's take some more questions and contributions. I'm just conscious of time. So start with this gentleman here, and then we'll go to Angus.
Nice one. Hi there, Ashley from Devon. We're in the renewable energy sector. A question, I suppose it's a bit more of a global question, but we're talking about energy security. If all of our turbines, solar panels, batteries, it's all coming from places like China, are we sort of shifting the gas issue with Russia to China? I know they have a lot of minerals in the Middle East, which again China are sort of then jumping in there. So are we just sort of saying, removing that problem and not creating another one, but is that just sort of, and also charging your battery too quickly will diminish the life of the battery. So I wouldn't try and charge it as quick as you can.
Okay. Angus. No, sorry, just in front, sorry. Angus, yeah, thank you.
Thanks, Ryan. Angus Hill from WA Communications. Thanks very much, everyone. Obviously, a lot of what we've spoken about is quite technical, and it's about pipes and things, and wires in the ground. To what extent do you think the kind of consumer element needs to be brought into this, and this kind of the scale of this challenge and how it's being tackled needs to be spoken to or with consumers and them kind of being engaged in this and kind of given the confidence that National Grid and others are dealing with this, particularly when you're thinking of the scale of heat pumps and EVs are going to be rolled out, and people kind of feeling that that's something that they are kind of comfortable doing with. Clearly, an element of that is around the political leadership that is kind of part of this. And then second question, if it's okay, is clearly we've spoken about the debate between hydrogen and heat pumps and how that fits into level of demand that might come down the track for electrification. Clearly, when everyone talks about this, they talk about we might need a mix for home heating. At what point do you think government needs to make decisions and kind of ultimately kind of pick winners of certain situations in order to give confidence to those investing and planning for future demand?
Great, thank you. And then this gentleman here.
Yes, Mark Sullivan, Warwick. I asked Professor Mawby what's his assessment of the proportion of asynchronous generated power that the national grid can accommodate, bearing in mind it operates at 50 cycles a second, and it's synchronous power that is the efficient power that's operated it for years. The figure I've heard is between 30 and 50% and sometimes 37%, but that's a University of Nottingham figure rather than the University of Warwick, and I'd be grateful for your advice on this. Thank you.
Great, thank you. Very informed audience.
Yeah,
you could all be panellists.
Yeah, good question.
You could all be panellists.
Good question.
So, right, I'm going to ask each of the panellists to respond to one or all of those questions and then just give final remarks as well. So I might start with Philip.
Well, it's a very good question. Well, I'll start with the first one, which asked about materials and bringing technology in from China. One of the big components of renewable energy is rare earth magnets, and they're used in all the generators for wind, etc. And of course, that's a technology which is China dominates the market in. It's a very dirty technology, but they sort of control the price of that and the supply of it. So they do have a big say over that technology, which is something that we have to be aware of, because if they turn that off, it scuppers your plans quite drastically because of the supply of this material. So that's, and that's true of many of the things. China is a monster. It is developing so fast. They are investing so fast in green technologies. They suffer much worse than we do in terms of pollution from coal-powered power stations, and they want to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So they're investing heavily in that. Yeah, I mean, somebody else was asking about networks and the resilience of them. I think when you look at electricity networks, it's a bit like an internet. The electricity networks at the moment, they're one-way traffic going from the generation out to the consumer. There has to be a completely different way of thinking about it, where it's a connection service that the DNOs and National Grid provide. So it's linking small networks together, transporting excess energy from A to B as it occurs, and this makes the whole system a lot more resilient. I mean, the internet was developed by the military in the US to be resilient. So if you knocked out one of the key components, it would bypass it and be able to still function. And the same is true of the electrical infrastructure, both nationally and globally. If you can make it so that it's resilient, so that the power can be rerouted automatically, then it makes it a lot stronger. And I think it's got a lot of parallels with the way the computer industry has developed over the last 30 years. And just one final point, the asynchronous network. I think this is, at the moment, all the turbines that generate electricity all go around at the same frequency. All these power stations all over the country go around at the same frequency, more or less. And that's the problem. If you don't have big machines rotating, big coal power or gas powered machines rotating, you lose that
Inertia.
Inertia.
That's the term we use.
That's the term you should use.
Okay. That's what I understand. Inertia.
What you have to do is generate that inertia artificially somehow.
And batteries are a good solution for that.
Yeah.
It's one of the biggest
So with
services in the growth of batteries.
there's no need to worry about that. I don't think on the grid you can generate that inertia artificially. Yeah, you
Batteries with power
compared to-
electronics. Yeah.
Batteries and power electronics.
A certain amount of asynchronous power entering the grid without destabilising.
No, you generate that. You take your DC and you generate AC from that using power electronics, which is what I talked about earlier. It's perfectly feasible to do that.
Right, Dominic, final thoughts from you.
Well, I'm definitely not going to get drawn into the asynchronous power with the professor sitting next to me, so I'm going to leave that graciously to one side. On the supply chain problem, I think that is something that people need to be considering. And yeah, the turbine. Yeah, there are some very substantial turbine manufacturers in Europe, Siemens Gamesa, for example. So we're not entirely reliant on China. But one of the supply chain things which has popped up in the last 4 months or so was a very interesting report by Standard & Poor's, which is looking at the amount of copper that there is going to be available, not now, but in about 5 or 6 years' time. That there's a prediction that there may be a shortfall in the production of copper. So we need to watch out for that and to prepare accordingly. But just because I'm also conscious of time, and just in sort of the summary, first of all, thank you all for coming. It's been a very interesting and very, very wide-ranging conversation. I think we've touched on absolutely everything from asynchronous generation to government policy and what needs to be done and whether we should or shouldn't have three-phase in our homes. But I think what it highlights to me is that there needs to be a continued focus on this, because we're at a party political conference where a lot of grand words are spoken about doing this and doing that, but a lot of the people who are uttering those words don't know what it takes to deliver it. And so, actually we've got at least 4 other people on this table, and I sort of excluded myself from this, who really know what they're talking about. And we need to keep this focus on what can we do, how can we do it. And the other one is when must we do it? And the answer to that last one is emphatically now.
Great, thank you. Thank you, Dominic. Clementine.
Angus, what you asked about picking winners. You also asked something else that I thought I should answer, and I forgot what it was.
Consumers in kind of talking about this, and you need to engage people in that conversation.
I'm always on the engagement thing. I'm always a bit reluctant to talk about engaging consumers, in the sense that often people mean educating them and asking everyone to be as excited about these often quite dull topics as we are. And I think a bit like requiring everyone to believe in climate change and to want to go green. If we're relying on that, then we're lost. What we need to be, if by engaging consumers you mean making stuff that customers want to buy that works and is good and is desirable, regardless of your kind of political ideology or outlook or biases, then absolutely. And the way that we do that is, again, by upturning that market, by turning it into a consumer market. I think we have the only the kind of the level of change and absolute globally structural change that we need to see in this marketplace is the only equivalent that we've seen since the Industrial Revolution is with the internet and with things like online retail. And and things like the iPhone and Uber, taxi cabs. It is not a coincidence that they were all consumer driven. If the government had set targets for getting online shopping going, and I think again the people lining up for the first iPhone at $1,000, who everyone thought was mad because they've got a perfectly good internet connection at home and a perfectly good camera and a perfectly good phone that sends texts and makes phone calls. I don't think anyone looking at those queues of those first people just wanting to get their hands on some exciting new tech could ever have predicted that the global taxi trade would be collapsing around their ears within the next decade as a result because of that kind of connectivity. So we have to, in terms of engagement, I don't think we need to talk to people or ask them to understand something. We just need to make sure that the products that we're selling are ones that people want to buy and enrich and improve their lives. And then we don't need to worry about how engaged people are. On the picking winners point, what I would say, so I do think actually the government needs to make a decision quite quickly, because what's happening at the moment is we've got a dual pathway, one of which is astonishingly expensive. So the amount of subsidy that is being poured into hydrogen in order to try and figure out if it even works as a technology is actually hundreds of millions of pounds. And I don't think failing to subsidise a nascent technology to the tune of hundreds of £1 million counts as picking a winner. I think let's let market forces decide. I'd be absolutely delighted for the government to remove the boiler upgrade scheme if they also decided that hydrogen pathway was not going to be the way to go. We're very, very happy to compete on our own 2 feet, so long as the market signals are, sending the right incentives.
Thanks, Clementine. I mean, you said no one could predict these future consumer trends. Somebody does and makes an astonishingly high amount of money from it. But you're right, most people don't. Over to you. Final words from you, Graeme.
So, nice and simple one. We must... So if there's one positive thing about the terrible state of the cost of energy right now, is it means people are thinking about what uses energy, right? It's a shame it's driven by fear, but what it is doing is people are thinking now about energy, whereas before it was a second tier, third tier thing. So using less is the best thing we can do. Insulate, using less is the very, very best thing. But I also think there's an element here that you can try and tell people or you show them. So with any of the technology disruptors, you didn't wake up one morning and say, I need a smartphone. Somebody showed you one and you thought, that was great. Clem's point completely. In the same way, people who drive EVs, if you stop them and ask them, they will tell you how great they are and how wonderful it is. And if you ask people with heat pumps, they'll tell you how wonderful they are. So I think for me, we need to be able to be having a real and honest and sensible debate. We need the consumers to ask difficult questions. What does it mean to me? How do I do this? What are the pros and cons? But I also think we need to bust some of the fear, uncertainty and doubt. Okay? We know that by burning stuff, that hurts the climate. We know that by burning stuff, it shortens people's lives and costs the NHS. And we know that there is a way of decoupling growth from pollution. So I think we need to be talking about those 3 things, because actually, if you talk to people in a room about climate change, 20% of the people in the room have already switched off. But if you talk to them about 40,000 people dying prematurely in the UK from poor air, you've got more people's attention. If you talk about we can't afford to get to net zero, we can't afford not to, and this is green and well-paid jobs, people are a bit more engaged. So I think we need a richness of conversation. And I guess so my point is, I'm delighted that you ask such a diverse group of people to answer some questions, and I look forward to further difficult questions being asked and having a richness of debate.
Thank you, Graeme. And thank you everyone for coming. It was an intimate discussion, but very, very detailed and very informative. Definitely one of the most detailed and informative fringes we've had here at Post Conference.
It's a bit of an unfair brain workout at this stage.
Yes, exactly.
You need to lie down in the dark room.
Yes, I do, after all the events that we've done. A big thank you to Enertechnos for partnering with us. We're very grateful for this partnership. I'm sorry the Minister wasn't able to be here, but I'm sure we can relay some of the arguments and the findings from this. Yes, we'll definitely send a link, make sure and test him on what he watched. If you want to know more about Bright Blue, please do speak to Joanna, and you can find out about how to become a member and support the work that we do. And we did recently publish a report to support the transition to electric vehicles and how you can catalyse that more. So please look on our website at that report. It's called Driving Uptake. So it leaves me really to say thank you very much for joining Bright Blue, and a big round of applause not only to the panellists, but for my team for delivering 32 events across Conservative Party Conference. So a round of applause, please.